Hello. Huge thanks to everyone who is joining us today. It's been really fun on our chat, watching everyone tuning in from truly all over the world, not even just the US. And so I am having the great pleasure of leading a conversation with Megan today. My name is Andrea Bartz. I am a thriller author, most recently of the psychological thriller We Were Never Here. But much more importantly and excitingly, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Megan Collins. As you all know, she is the wonderful author of The Winter Sister, Behind the Red Door, and this month's Barnes & Noble monthly pick, The Family Plot, which we will have the pleasure of discussing today. So many of you sent us some really awesome, excellent questions ahead of today, and I have those, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can as we chat and as I kind of trot them out in front of Megan. In addition, there is a Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. And if you have additional questions, maybe about something that we're talking about right on the spot, you can add them there. We're so sorry in advance for those that we can't get to, but we're going to get to as many as we can. And as you've probably noticed, the chat is for saying hi. Barnes & Noble is there to help with any tech problems. And specifically, the Q&A is there for any questions that you would like to add. So without further ado, Megan, hello, huge congrats on The Family Plot being a BNN monthly pick this month.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Barnes & Noble for picking it in the first place. It's been the most exciting thing. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in today, and thank you so much for being here to moderate and ask the questions. Anyone who hasn't read Andrea's We Were Never Here, you need to get on that because it is one of the best thrillers ever. And I don't say that lightly as I read a ton of thrillers. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to jump right into questions because I'm sure everyone is very eager to hear from you. But something that I would love to hear, and also was a question from Mary B. Mulligan and from Joanne Moss, was really about the origin of the story. So where did the idea for The Family Plot originate? And can you just tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so, well, first, for anybody who hasn't read the book, the premise is it's about this true crime obsessed family who have lived a very strange life. They're sort of secluded on this New England island off the coast of Rhode Island. And their parents have raised these 4 children who are now adults on this diet of true crime, basically. And each of the children is named after a famous victim of murder. So right away, you know, this is not your typical family. And they learned about true crime stories alongside learning science and math in their homeschool curriculum. And they would have these sort of honoring ceremonies for different victims of serial killers, murderers, all of that. And there was also a serial killer active on their island while they were growing up. So they have just been totally steeped in this their whole lives. And when the book opens, the adult children are now returning to their home after 7 years for one, 10 years for the other, because their father has died. And so they're going to bury their father. But when they dig up his grave in the family plot, they discover the remains of their brother who went missing when the main character, Dahlia, was a teenager. So now they have to, you know, they're dealing with the tragedy, with trauma, but they also have to deal with what happened, who murdered their brother, how has it gone undetected all this time, and all of that. And so usually when I'm coming up with stories, the premise usually comes to me from like a what if question that really fascinates me. Like, what if, I mean, if I had come from it this way, it would be like, what would happen if a family that's obsessed with true crime suddenly becomes the center of a true crime? But that's actually not how it came to me for this. I was trying to title it something completely different that I was working on, and I just couldn't figure out a good title for it. And I was having this like brainstorming breakfast with my husband, and I just said, I need something that relates to the family aspect of the book. My books are always about families in some way. And so he just threw out the first family oriented phrase he could think of off the top of his head. And he said, The Family Plot. And I was like, no, that doesn't work for this, but That's a great title, and I'm obsessed with it immediately. And so, even though I tried to keep working on the thing I was working on, this title just kept coming back to me. And I remember I was getting ready one morning and like the premise just popped into my head that a family gathers for the funeral of one and they find out that another has been murdered because that body is in the grave that was meant for the person who's recently died. And I was like, whoa, that's dark, that's creepy. I'm immediately obsessed. I like burst into the bathroom where my husband was brushing his teeth and I screamed out the premise at him and he was like, okay. um, but so so from there I started to think, okay, well, what kind of family would this be most interesting to have this very weird conflict happen to? And so I'm someone who's really interested in true crime. So that was sort of already in my mind. And I just thought it would be really cool if, not cool, it would be really interesting if it was a family who had grown up knowing all about these murder stories. And now they have this kind of insane murder story in their own family.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a hell of a hook, as we say in the business of, a premise that really makes you want to know everything. And we are going to go more into the true crime aspect, which is something we have some really juicy questions on. But first, I would just love to talk more about this extremely memorable cast of characters that you related, that you came up with, especially this family. So can you talk just a little bit about sort of developing, this family of four kids, two parents living on this kind of very remote island, and how you sort of develop their distinct characters within this distinct setting?
Yeah, so that was definitely actually a challenge when I was writing this because in my previous books, I'd had much smaller nuclear families. It was usually either just one child, now an adult, and then either one parent or two parents, but one was kind of not really around. So I had to like create this whole family with four siblings. The dad obviously is dead from the very beginning because that's what kicks off the book. But the mother is still there. And I also knew that, it wasn't just about creating each of these characters. It was also about establishing what are their individual relationships with each other and what are their relationships like when they're in a room together, and what if there's only three of them there, and what if there's two, and what does that look like? So it really started with me thinking of how each person reacts to this crazy discovery that they make at the beginning of the book. And in my head, I didn't know why this was there, but what came up for me was that the mother was just going to like feverishly bake cookies,
Mm.
and that was going to be her response. And I was like, that's interesting because that's not normally what you do when you realize there's been a murder in your family. Um, so then I had to look at that and think, okay, why is she baking cookies? And so part of what you explore with her character in the book is as she's the one who raised them on this curriculum of true crime basically, and she was really the one gunning for let's name them after these famous murder victims and all that. She's starting to question like, did I lead my family down this path where now we have this darkness circling us? And so she's sort of overcorrecting in the other direction, and just suddenly she's like, I just want to like be the little TV mom or something making cookies, but she's constantly burning them and the kids are like, what are you doing? And then the oldest brother, Charlie, who's 10 years older than the main character, Dahlia, he I figured out that his reaction was that he was going to create this murder museum based off of what their childhood was like growing up, because everybody on this island they lived on was always suspicious of them because of this weird way that they lived. And he kind of gets it in his head that he's like, well, I'm going to show them that this weird thing has just happened in our backyard, but like we're just like everybody else, even though like what he's doing is showing exactly that they're not. But so he's putting all his energy into, we're going to like put all the furniture aside, set up with these paintings that one of us did, and these murder reports that we wrote when we were kids, having to make theories about unsolved cases and all these different things. And so that immediately made me think, okay, well, he is someone who's like sort of a performer. And so I filled in that he had been kind of an actor for the past 10 years or so. And which is kind of interesting because he lived such a secluded life, but so now he's gone the other way, trying to like be out there and be in everybody's faces. And then the oldest sister, Tate, um, I had actually, I had just learned about I always forget the name of it, but it's in the acknowledgments of the book. It's Frances Glessner Lee's, I can't remember. It's something about nutshells and murders. And it's basically, she created these dioramas of murder scenes, these really intricate dioramas. And they were used decades ago as ways to train detectives to look at a murder scene and try to figure out where the clues are and what might have happened. And all the information you needed was right there. It was just about puzzling and putting it together. And if anybody follows me on Instagram or anything, then you know that I love miniatures. I have a mini Monday feature every Monday, or I show another mini thing. So that the mini thing and murder together just was combining two things I'm very fascinated with. So I knew I wanted to do something like that. So I had Tate, this older sister, be sort of the artist of the family. And she has been creating, she has this popular Instagram where for the last however many years, she's been making these really intricate dioramas based on the murders within their own island and the unsolved cases, because the serial killer has never been caught. And so that kind of filled in a lot of blanks for me for her. And I had to think, okay, why is she doing that? Why is she focusing on something so dark and still, and like, but there's also like this talk about how she always dresses very brightly, so it's sort of this contrast. And I don't want to say too much about why she does that, because that's sort of part of the discovery in the book. But so it was really in figuring out those reactions that they had to this, that was how I was able to start figuring out these characters. And then Dahlia, who's the main character and was Andy, who's the murdered brother, was his twin. She's just kind of reacting to them at first, besides reacting to the loss in general. But she's just kind of like, everything you guys are doing is completely bonkers right now. It doesn't make any sense. Like, we should be focusing on figuring out who killed Andy, and you are not. And so I'm going to go do that. And so that really spurs her on to figure this out, because for the last 7 years, she has believed, as the family believed, that their brother ran away because there was this runaway note. And so she has spent her time trying to find him, doing these weird internet searches that are sort of like cyclical and repetitive, and looking for him on social media, looking for him in newspapers and all of that. And so now she's doing much different kind of search to figure out what happened to him. But that sort of still plays into the same kind of thing she was doing for the past 7 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting to think about how you started with the hook, with this big sort of premise, and figured out characters' reactions, and then from there use their reactions to sort of inform you, the author, of like, who are these people and what makes them different and unique. And you really feel it when you're reading, because it's, you know, a pretty big cast, like you said, it's a pretty big family, and yet the scenes, they all feel so distinct. You could hear their voices and see them in your head. So it's something that everyone who has read, I'm sure, experienced, and those who haven't, it's really something to pay attention to and admire. One question that we got from Sarah Allred was, who was your favorite character to write and why?
Thank you for that question. I always seem to pick, for every book that I write, my favorite character to write is always the one that readers, I think, have the most trouble with, or either don't like, or whatever. And so for this book, that was Charlie, who the oldest brother. And it's not, I haven't gotten a lot that people say they don't like him, but just that, I mean, there's just a lot going on with him. He has this very like dark sense of humor, which is why he was so fun to write. And he provides these little dark humor, comedic moments to break the tension a little. But he's also, just like everybody else, his reaction is so bizarre, and he's just wanting, he's like, this isn't really too much of a spoiler, but there's a part where he takes everybody's doors off their hinges and he's like, we're going to use these in the museum. And so he's just like not recognizing that Dahlia's going through something huge right now. She's lost her twin. And so he's a little hard to love, I think, but I really had such a fun time writing him. There's so much going on behind the scenes in his past that's really informing him, as there is with all the characters. But I feel like I miss writing him the most.
Yeah. And Charlie has a really distinct, sort of voice and presence that is felt within this house, within this creepy mansion on a creepy island. So it's not super surprising to me that that was a favorite of yours. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the true crime element, which there were some really great questions about. I'm going to start with a question from Megan Clemens that I know the answer to, but I think it's a great launching point for us. Said the family plot was a nod to murder victims. Do you love true crime / murder documentaries, Megan Collins?
I do. If you can't tell. Yeah, so in that respect, like there wasn't a ton of research that I had to do with this, because a lot of the references that they make, because there's tons of true crime references in the book, since that was such a part of their world and their family culture. I didn't have to do a lot of research for that, although then I would have these moments where I'd be like, okay, I need a reference to like a serial killer from the 70s, and I would just like look something up real quick, and then my search history was really dodgy for a few months. But yeah, so I think it was inevitable that I would write a book like this, because especially the few years leading up to writing it, I was like my most obsessed with true crime ever. And I think that that's been happening culturally as well. And with just the amount of content we have available to us in that regard, with the documentaries and the shows and the movies and the podcasts and books and all of that. What's kind of funny is I was realizing this the other day, that since writing this book and since publishing it and talking about it a lot, I think my consumption of true crime has actually gone down a lot. And I think it's because of the book kind of does critique that a little bit. What I wanted to do when I knew I was going to be writing about true crime and our obsession with it, and by extension my obsession with it, was to really look at that and look at, why are we so interested in it, in these super dark stories? Why do we go there? Why can people binge a show where they're just watching episode after episode after episode of these really dark things? So how is that serving us? Because it must be in some way. But also on the flip side, what does that do to us, and how does that get into our psyches and kind of reprogram some things in a way? So I think in doing that, in writing this book, I was realizing a lot more about a lot of my own like interests, and the ways that in the true crime community there's this whole thing about, oh well, we're always talking about the victims, we're always doing this because of the victims, we're not here to celebrate or glorify the killers. But what I've kind of said since like doing events with this book is that I realized, well, I know a lot of killers' names, and I don't necessarily know all the victims' names. So there's something there that, even though we do say, and I believe that we earnestly believe that it's about the victims, but I think that that can't always be the case, because once you start telling the story, it can't be divorced from the fact of their murder or the fact of the killer that comes into it. So because of that, I didn't like consciously do it, but I think I just kind of stepped back a little with my consumption of it. But of course, like if I see something that comes on TV that seems like it's going to be really juicy, I'll still be like, ooh, okay, I got to tune into that.
Yeah, that's so interesting that actually the process of writing the book and promoting it have changed your relationship with true crime. That's really cool. We got a really interesting question from Malaya Key. Apologies in advance for also any names that I'm butchering. The question was, what was the first case that you felt a deep connection with? Which one hit home for you?
Oh, that's such a good question. I there's one case that got me into true crime, which was the West Memphis 3 case, which was these 3 um, young kids in Arkansas. Is that where Memphis is? I don't know. Were killed, and at first they didn't know who did it, and then they ended up arresting these 3 teenage boys because they wore black, they listened to heavy metal, so of course, like, they're out there killing kids. It was like satanic panic type stuff, and they spent 18 years in jail. They were obviously convicted of this. One of them was on death row, but there were a number of documentaries, which is how I found out about this, particularly the Paradise Lost documentaries, which were on HBO, and then there was a West of Memphis one more recently, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it was just so fascinating to me. I mean, it was a horrible, brutal story, but the way that people latched on to like, these 3 kids did it, these teenagers did it, because look how he's drawing during the testimony and the trial, like, he clearly doesn't care, and it's like they're teenagers being accused of murder. And so that really sunk into me, and plus the documentaries are so extremely well done, so I was just like, I want more of this. But like, to as one that kind of literally hits home, there were some girls who went missing in the town. Well, one of them was the town that I grew up in for sort of half of my childhood. Um, and like, very creepy stories. Like, they were riding their bike. What didn't happen at the same time, but one was riding her bike to go, like, she had found a butterfly and she wanted to put it in an envelope and bring it home. And so she went out to do that, and they saw her bike, never found her again. And another girl close by went missing in a very similar way. And that happened before I was born, but it was still something that, as I got older, I started to kind of tap into and realize that that was kind of in public consciousness. And because it happened so close to me, and then later, much later in life, I found out that my old dance teacher had been the sister of one of the girls. Um, so I always think of that too as one that really feels a little personal, even though I had no connection to them other than like location. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's like a haunting thing for sure.
Yeah, yeah, the details of that are so creepy. There's a podcast called You're Wrong About that had an episode not too long ago on true crime. And they were sort of discussing, this just made me think of it. They were discussing how part of our obsession with true crime, with hearing these stories, and analyzing them and reading them and becoming convinced that we can figure out who did it and sort of why, is that it gives us this, stokes our anxiety, but then it gives us this feeling of like, if I can figure out exactly how and why it happened, then like I can keep myself safe, or I can keep my kids safer, I can keep my family safer, something like that. And the reality is, many of these will never be solved. These victims, very much for the vast majority, did not do anything that put them in an inordinate amount of danger. So it is interesting, our sort of that like deep id connection to why we really want to hear these stories, and why they like somehow make us feel simultaneously more endangered but also safer by learning about them. And that's something that really the lighthouses, especially this mom who's sort of creating this environment for her kids, seems to be putting on them.
Mhm. Yeah, she definitely is of the mind that this is a way to prepare you for the brutality of life and anything that you might encounter. Um, but yeah, and I mean, I think that's true for myself. I always say, you've probably heard me say this before, that I will not answer the door when it rings if I don't know someone's coming, because I am convinced it's a murderer. I was talking to my editor the other day, and she said the exact same thing. And but at the same time, there is that thought when you're listening to these stories that it's almost like, okay, well, now that I know that specific story, that can't happen to me because I've already heard it. So that would be too insane for that kind of thing to happen to me. And it's just all this like magical thinking kind of thing that isn't logical. But yeah, that's definitely one of the ways that I think it does serve us. Sort of, it feeds into our anxiety. It validates our anxiety that like things are scary in the world. but it also makes us have this maybe false sense that we're prepared for these things.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's very fun to watch. I mean, clearly our sort of cultural obsession with true crime is like an interesting and very juicy topic. And so it's fun to watch how it's sort of explored in a really thoughtful way in the form of this novel that's also super gripping. A quick question just came in from Kate that said, I like to think of myself as an amateur sleuth. Are there clues in the story that might lead us to the killer? Absolutely. If you are, I mean, this is a whodunit of the, nth degree and a very high caliber. So if you're a whodunit fan, very highly recommend The Family Plot. And speaking of sort of, feeding through clues and helping us figure out what's going on, a lot of people had really great questions about craft. So let's start with a great question from Mark Massaro. What is your writing process? Can you kind of walk us through, you've had this idea, now how does it become a book?
Yeah, so I am such a plotter. I have to outline everything ahead of time. I have to know where I'm going, or else I just would be paralyzed in front of my laptop. So once I have the premise and like kind of the characters all set, I have to figure out who did the thing. And so once I figured that out, and it was actually funny for this book because for a while I was convinced I knew who did it and I was telling my husband about it. And he was like, I don't know. Like, I feel like that's not who did it. I feel like this character did it. And I was like, excuse me, who are you? I am the writer. And then like I thought about it for 5 minutes. I was like, you're right. So he gave me both the title and redirected me when I kind of I think was doing sort of a cop out of who did it. But so once I figure that out, then I want to figure out what the midpoint is going to be. What's going to happen at the middle of the book that's either going to be a twist or going to just set the characters off in another direction or really up the stakes, up the tension. And once I have those three things, the premise, the midpoint, and the ending, I just kind of work to fill in the gaps. Okay, what needs to happen? What clues need to sort of be unraveled? What leads are there that the characters follow from the beginning to the middle? And then once things are sort of pivoted for them based on whatever happens there, what direction do they look now? And how do we lead up to how they actually find out the truth? So once I figure out all that and have that all outlined, then right before I write each chapter, I do an outline of the chapter. So I'm like constantly outlining and it's ridiculous. I have so many outlines. And of course, and things still change and things still surprise me when I'm writing. But usually the big giant pieces stay the same throughout.
Okay. Yeah. Something that in sort of different words, both Leah Mitchell and Angela Hahn asked was sort of how are you outlining so that you can make sure to keep the suspense? Actually, sorry, that was a Carmen Norris question. How do you keep the suspense high throughout? And how do you sort of keep uncovering and sort of, turning over cards that are clues that balance keeping that mystery moving and also leading us to, helping us figure out the answer, but without making it too obvious? How are you sort of making the mystery work?
That's a great question. And I think we're, as writers, probably always asking ourselves that question.
Like, please tell me, help me.
and figuring out what to do. But I think, and I can't remember who said this. Somebody said it at some point. I know this isn't my original idea, but somebody said that each chapter in a book should both answer a question and ask a new question. And so that's kind of how I think about each beat in my book, each chapter of my book. The characters should learn something new that's going to help them along in this journey, but there should also be a new part of the mystery or a new element that they have to look into or a new something that doesn't make sense that they have to try to uncover. And I think that if you keep those things in mind, then those clues kind of, not naturally, there's still a lot of work to be done, but a little more organically fall into place and you can figure out where they need to go so that you're not doing like 6 clues in one chapter and then you have 3 chapters with absolutely nothing new that's happening. So that's how I tend to think of it.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. something, a lot of people have questions about sort of your writing schedule. Teresa Selstrom asked, what's your writing schedule? Do you write every day? And Aaron Miles wants to know, how long did it take you to finish the family plot? How long does it typically take to finish writing a book? And how much time do you spend on the research piece?
Um, I'll start with the research. Like I said, for this book, it was more, well, actually for everything I've written, most of the research I do, I tend to do along the way while I'm writing. I think if I had to do a ton of research up front, I would start to get bored, or I would start to lose my way because I just want to get into the creation of the story and the characters. So unless I have a big thing I need to learn, like a job that someone has that I know nothing about that needs to be in the story, I just kind of wait until those questions pop up for me in the story, and then I'll just do a Google search, go down a rabbit hole for 20 minutes or whatever it is, and then I'll get back into it. And so for my schedule, I do write every day. I write every weekday. If I'm not on, if my deadline isn't swiftly approaching. If I have a close deadline, I'll write every single day. Um, and I usually just try to, I'm at my best, I think, in the morning. Um, and then my brain sort of like dies out a little bit as the day goes along. So I try to get as much done as I can before lunch, and then whatever else I have to do to meet my word count goal, or hit a certain scene or whatever, I try to slog through that in the afternoon. Um, and in terms of how long this book took, so this book came together fairly quickly, the first draft at least, because I'd had the idea interrupting that other book that I thought I was going to be writing. And then I had to like put together a whole new proposal, a whole new outline, synopsis, figure out what this story even was, and then really start writing. So I probably wrote it in about 5 months, which isn't like ridiculously fast, but also it felt fast. But then I had to revise it for, I think I spent 2 months revising it, and there was a lot of work for that. I had to essentially rewrite like the second half of the book and the things in the first half that would need to be changed because of the changes in the second half. So there was a lot of work with that, but um, yeah, I think I answered all those.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, I think you got them all. I threw a lot at you at once.
No, it was good.
Um, a great question from Elizabeth De Palma was, what was the biggest challenge you faced while writing the family plot?
That's a great question. Um, well, I think the greatest challenge I faced was writing it during the pandemic, because I was writing it right when the pandemic started and everything was changing. Although in one sense, it, I don't mean to say this and be insensitive. I know like it was a terrible time, but it did allow us to be home. A lot of people, I had been teaching at that point, and suddenly now I was teaching virtually, which in that first year, it was only like a couple hours a day. So I had so much more time to write all of a sudden. And it was also a weird thing, because you would think like writing such a dark story during such a dark time would just be like, I'd need to see my therapist every single day. But it was actually a strange escape to be able to go into the darkness of this story that was nothing like the darkness happening in our world. So, but it definitely was, I think, for all writers, all creatives, everybody, a challenging time. And then the other biggest challenge about it, like I said, was the figuring out the family dynamics and really working through those and trying to make them, the relationships between each character, feel distinct and feel like it's not just the same relationship you're getting over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you succeeded at that. Lori Johnston had a great question for all of the writers out there. What's the single best piece of advice on writing that you've ever received?
Ooh. Do you have one? Do you want to go first? Do you have
Oh
a?
gosh. I mean, I think mine is, maybe this sounds like a cop out, but I think mine is simple as like, write. You're going to learn, you learn by writing. It's so easy to think that, well, I can write this book once I've taken this class, or once I have an MFA, or once I have more time, or once I X, Y, and Z. And like, you get better at things by doing them. And that's true of playing tennis, and that's true of playing the piano, and that's true of rocket science, and it is true of writing. So if you want to be a writer, you should write. It doesn't mean you need to write every single day. It doesn't mean you need to torture yourself. But like, if you want to get better at writing, sit down and write.
Yeah, and sort of similarly, the advice that I've sort of been regurgitating for the past year or so is author Megan Abbott's advice that I saw her give in some interview or podcast last year when The Turnout came out, which is another great book. If people haven't read that, you should check it out. She said, write badly. And I have written that on a sticky note that I have on my desk. And I can't tell you how much that has freed me in moments, because you sit there and you think, okay, like I want this to be good. And like, of course you want it to be good, but that's so much pressure to put on yourself. And so if you just say, well, I'm just going to write the most garbage version of this that I can, then you're just free to let the words, let the story come out. And what I usually find is then when I look back, like it's not that bad. Like it still needs work, but it's not the garbage version I was intending. And that is only because I felt freed up by that. So I think that that's perfect advice that she gives, and that now I give.
Yeah. A sort of related platitude I often say is, well, you can't edit a blank page. It's like, just get something down, and then you have something to work with. Like,
Right.
just keep create content, and then you can go from there. We are starting to wind down on our time, but I'm going to sort of hit you with some great questions that have come in today. Cynthia just wanted to say how great this book is. Absolutely agree. Jet G said, as a plotter, so for those who don't know, that means, you're someone who has your whole outline before you start writing. Do you create a lot of detail about your characters before you start writing the story?
Ooh, that's a great question. Because no, I always find that as much as I know the plot so intricately through the outlining process, I really get to know the characters once I'm actually drafting, because that's when you're still thinking about plot, but you're having to move the plot through the vehicle of these characters. And so that's when the specifics about them come in. That's when the sort of texture of their gestures, the ways that they talk, the things I can't stop thinking about comes in. So I'll have like some kind of big things that I know about each character to guide me. But I'm not somebody who like writes a dating profile for their characters. Like I know some people do those as exercises, which seem really fun, but I don't know like what my characters eat for breakfast. I know that a lot of people also could rattle off that information. I don't know what sign they are. It's just, it's kind of more like confined to what I learn about them through the story that's actually on the page. And so if they have breakfast on the page, then I guess I would know, but they don't do a lot of eating actually, which I always notice. I'm always like, they're never eating. How are they surviving? They're just having trauma.
Mine too. It's one of the least interesting things they do. A cool question from Tammy West. Where do you look, or who/what do you look at for inspiration? I noticed you mentioned your husband. Are there other people, places, or things that you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like the other writers and the writing community at large. And you and I have become friends because we debuted at the same time, and like, oh my God, I don't know what I'd do without being able to text you like all the craziness of this world. um, and just being inspired by your work, by other writers in the thriller genre. And I think also just I sort of draw inspiration from things I've felt really potently, or really strong emotional experiences that kind of work their ways into my book. Like I always say that my books are sort of metaphors for things that I've either lived or things that I want to explore or things I want to express. So like terrible things happen in all my books, and those things luckily have not happened to me, but they're still shaped around my experiences in a way, on definitely an emotional level.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have a question from Olja Vagunovic. I love Family Plot, but my favorite is The Winter Sister, your debut, speaking of. So she said, so what other things should we be looking for in the near future from you? What's sort of in the pipeline from you?
Well, thank you so much for shouting out my debut. I'm currently working on my next book. I'm sort of rewriting the next book. I had a draft. It needs many, many, many changes. So I am working really, really hard on that. And as just like a little tidbit about it, it's about this pair of really, really close sisters-in-law who have been best friends since they met, basically. And there's sort of a rift that comes between them for the first time when the man who connects them, which is the husband of one, the brother of the other, becomes the main suspect in this really high profile murder. And one of them is having doubts that maybe he's not innocent, whereas the other one is like, no, he could not have done this. Somebody else did this. So that's what I'm working on now. And hopefully it'll be out next year. Give me your great writing and revising vibes.
We're all hoping for it. Well, we're going to wrap up with something that Sam Barnato, Darla Thompson, and Carla DeWald all kind of asked in different words. Is just what drew you to the world of mystery and suspense and darkness and sort of this genre, and what do you love about it?
It's funny. I get kind of the flip side of that question a lot, which is that I think when people read my books and they haven't met me or seen me, they think I'm going to be a certain way. And then I get this thing where I do an event or something and people will say, you know, you're like very lighthearted, you're making jokes, you have a smile on your face. Like, why do you write such dark stuff? And so I think that it's because there is, there is light and dark in both of us, and I'm able to be a smiling person, maybe because in part I get out all the darkness on the page. It's also, mysteries and thrillers are such, the conflicts are so juicy and so high stakes and extreme, and that just is, has so much potential for drama and interesting characters and creepiness. I love creepiness. But it's funny because I sort of happened into this genre accidentally. When I was writing The Winter Sister, my debut, I wasn't necessarily thinking of it as a mystery or a thriller. I was just writing the story that I wanted to tell. I mean, I knew that there was a murder mystery in it, but I didn't think of it in terms of like, this is where it is in the market. It was just sort of, this is what I want to talk about. And then when it was marketed as a mystery or thriller, I was like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I guess I did write that. And then I was really excited about that because I was like, okay, that's where I go next. Like, I'm gonna like go creepier, I'm gonna go darker, I'm gonna really play with that, I'm gonna make an even more messed up family. And so yeah, I just really love the opportunity to have it as sort of a place to get out all those like dark, gross, like uncomfortable thoughts that we have or experiences that we have. And again, I just love the opportunities for conflicts, for just really memorable clashes between people.
Yeah, yeah, everything is high stakes when there's like literal life and death going on in your
Yeah.
plots, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I always joke, I like you, we had our first books come out around the same time. And so we've met a lot of people, of other authors in this, in our genre, in the industry. I always say like, gosh, thriller writers are just the nicest people. They are so nice. And I think it's because we all just channel all of our darkness into our stories. And we have like this safe little playground for like playing out all of our darkest thoughts. And who knows what sort of like, crooked and creepy, like wish fulfillment is going into that, and anger and dark feelings. So it's all very safely contained in these little books that are hopefully very entertaining to read.
Yeah, I was actually talking to my therapist about the thing that I'm hopefully maybe going to work on next. And I was explaining like ways it would be a very good cathartic experience for me for one thing in particular. And she was like, "Oh, your work is therapy." And I was like, "Yes." And she was
Yeah.
very excited by that.
Yes, we are all just like working out all of our dark sides into our novels and hopefully writing something that's very fun to read at the end.
Mhm.
That's sort of the goal. Well, I want to hugely thank everybody for coming today. Copies of The Family Plot are available 24/7 at bn.com, at your local Barnes & Noble stores. Connie George had asked if signed copies are available at any Barnes & Noble. I'm not sure, that's putting you on the spot, but I'm not sure if there's local ones, or I know around the holidays, if there are sometimes times that we're able to do campaigns with sending book plates and stuff like that.
I did sign in my local stores, which are Barnes and Noble Glastonbury and Barnes and Noble Barnes and Noble Buckland Hills in Connecticut. I don't know if you can order from a specific store and get it shipped to you, but if that's something you're interested, maybe you could actually call the Glastonbury store, because they said that they'll get in touch with me when they have more come in, so I could maybe personalize it. I mean, I don't want to promise too much, but I think it's a possibility for sure.
Yes. And regardless, like if you have not picked up your copy yet, absolutely get it. It's at a great price at Barnes & Noble right now, and it's such a fantastic read. Also, highly, highly recommend Behind the Red Door and The Winter Sister, Megan's earlier books. And again, just, yeah, thank everyone so much for coming. And Megan, thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this today.
Oh my God, thank you so much for being a part of this today. This was great. And thank you so much to everybody for coming and for your questions, and Barnes and Noble. Again, this was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy your rest of the week.
Bye.
Bye.